Hello and welcome everyone to our conversation today with Anong Migwans Beam. My name is Georgiana Uhlyarik and I am the Fredrik S. Eaton Curator of Canadian Art and the co-lead of the Indigenous and Canadian Art Department at the Art Gallery of Ontario. I would like to thank the TD Ready Commitment, our lead sponsor of talks and performances, for generously sponsoring this talk. I am speaking to you from Toronto, which is a territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga of the Credit. This land is governed by treaties that protect the land and great waters of these Great Lakes, and the principles of treaty making, that of peace and respect, friendship, reciprocity, and non-interference, are at the core of the work that I do, or I try to do, I endeavor to do in the Canadian Art Department and Indigenous Canadian Art Department at the AGO. I want to say just a few words about Anong before we get started, and I'm going to share my screen. Here we are. I hope everyone can see it. Anong Migwans Beam is a mother, artist, paint maker from Mchigeeng First Nation on Manitoulin Island. And as I think we will hear, she's inspired by the physical history of the place, the natural landscape, and the relationship between water and memory. She's had exhibitions and has been collected across Canada and the United States. And currently she has an exhibition at the Campbell House Museum, which is currently closed, as we all are. But there is a wonderful virtual tour with the curator and then responses from Anong that I really encourage everyone to look for and experience. And I'm really hoping that this lockdown and this pandemic will soon end so we can all gather together and see Anong's beautiful paintings in person. Anong from joining us today and and welcoming us to Manitoulin Island. I couldn't help but include this image, not only to remind us of summer and beautiful weather, but also just this unbelievable place that is the largest freshwater island in the world. And I know that growing up, your childhood continues to inspire the life and the art that you make. And I wonder if we would start speaking about that.
Yeah, definitely. That's for sure the beginning of my life in art started so early because my parents were both practicing artists, and I was so fortunate because they carried me along everywhere. And I was homeschooled, and they traveled for their practice, for their exhibitions, and they also traveled widely for their interests. And in the early part of their careers, they were really interested in watercolors and also in handmade indigenous ceramics. And that entire process attaches you to the earth so fundamentally because you're digging, you're looking, learning how to spot clay that's going to have the aspects that you're looking for as a ceramicist and a potter and a builder. And then they were also really investigating different paints that they used for their ceramic work. And it comes back to me much later in life, but at the time it didn't really register. I think it's those kinds of experiences that you have that are so, they're so close up to you that you take them in as life, but it doesn't have a label. It's probably how
Mm,
I think like the children of watchmakers would have such a fundamental knowledge of gears and watchmaking, but they wouldn't consider themselves to know it as a craft. And
right.
so it was really beautiful to me. I loved all of that, those early years, and being able to be right in the earth and the dirt and
Mm-hmm.
rocks. And later I went to art school, and I went to so many art schools. Like I did 5 art schools in 4 years.
I
But
think your whole
I
life has
kept
been art
going.
school, no?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. My parents both with their ceramic interests, they also had full size etching presses, etching inks. They worked in watercolor, they did oil painting. My mother had her degree in sculpture from Buffalo University. She actually exhibited at the AGO in the late 60s in the chair show, which is
Oh,
a
yes.
big
That was a
sculpture
beautiful
chair.
exhibit. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I I really soaked in a lot of that without really understanding what it was that I had learned until later. And I traveled quite a bit, and my father passed away, and my my mother is in long term care currently. And so, I think everybody, when they get to that next stage in their life, you have
Mm,
children and you become the same age that your parents were at moments that you remember. So I found myself at a lot of those points where I'm the same age that my dad was at points, and my children are at that age. And I think you almost have like a double reckoning of where you see something, and it's your children doing something you remember doing as a child yourself, and it gives you
mm.
that great second experience of childhood.
You have
So
you have some amazing stories I've heard you tell about being in New Mexico with your father and looking for clay and speaking to members of the Pueblo and their experience and their knowledge and trading with them to get a certain kind of clay. I remember you telling this amazing story. Um, and
that
it
was there are certain paint stones that and this comes up again later in my paint making chapter, really, that
mm,
um, they had a fascination with what they were doing, and they called it a buzz, that it was just this all-consuming desire to be chasing down, well, how do you do this? And one of the mysteries they really searched on was, how did the Anasazi and Pueblo ware of the American Southwest, how did they get paint that was made from rocks that would stay black and not fire out in the heat of the firing process?
mm,
Because the firing process will burn away almost anything, and it's very rare to find paints that can endure that heat process.
yeah.
And he searched all over for the black paint stone, and he thought that it was Rocky Mountain beeweed. He was like collecting little fact bits in journals, and oh, it must be Rocky Mountain beeweed. So then we had to find Rocky Mountain beeweed, and he was like grinding it up and trying different ways, and it wasn't. I think that must have been part of the binder recipe. But in the end, he met a lot of indigenous artists in pueblos, in Santa Clara Pueblo, and in Hopi at First Mesa. And he traded with Dewey and Juanita Healy, who were ceramic artists there. And I remember we drove all the way down there in a blue station wagon with a bearskin and cans of coffee, and that was his gift. And he got a great big can of black paintstone rocks.
I
And
remember you
he
saying
was
that
just so thrilled.
you might you may still have a little bit of it. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly? That you
Yeah, I do. It's still in the same coffee can.
and as
Mhm.
we're
A
looking
little
at
goes
this,
a long way.
as we're looking at these photographs, I'm really struck by how some of this imagery actually, and as we will see in some of your paintings, appears in some of your paintings. Obviously, he Carl Beam, but also all the cars, and of course the image of the Thunderbird. And here, these are just beautiful photographs. I had the great honor of meeting your mom long ago. It was just beautiful to see this photograph, and I so relate to what you're speaking about, the way in which time kind of collapses onto itself when you become a parent and you're experiencing past, present, and future all at once. And I think again, you are able to bring that quality of collapsing time into your work, and I think we will speak to that as we move through. And here are some more photographs of
Oh,
you.
this image on the left is my mom. She's smoothing out a bowl that she's built, and what was unique about their practice was everything was hand built, and that's so different from the majority of ceramic practices that involve the wheel and those kinds of ways of building shapes. And if you look at the bowl on the right, that's painted with that black stone
Mm,
from Hopi. And it's amazing that that's fired outside in an outdoor pit firing, but
um,
it's so skillfully done. They got so good at it that there aren't even any flares or smudges on there, even though it was in a fire.
right.
And it took them a long time to get there. They said that in the beginning they blew up 90% of their wares, exploded trying to do it properly.
We're very lucky. Just last year, we were able to bring in two bowls, two ceramic bowls into the AGO collection. So we now have that work represented. So of course, as I mentioned before, your father appears in some of the work. The whale, of course, with which he identified a great series of his the whale of our being, and an image of him. But tell us the name of this work and how what the photo transfer and oil paint. Is that right?
Yeah, this is kind of how I think most artists will start out. You know, you start out learning by doing what you see around you, and for sure that's how I started, just always kind of trying out what they were doing, because those are the materials that are around. And for me, photo transfer was really what was happening. And my dad was utilizing all kinds of methods to incorporate a photo image into the body of a painting. And for him, he used this painting is called Delta, and it's a portrait of my dad. And it's a 6 foot by 8 foot painting. It was commissioned by a longtime collector of his, and who asked me, "Could you do a portrait of your father?" And it was almost such an over ask. It was right on the edge of being like offensive. And I think I told him, "Yeah, but I can only do a painting that I'll really like not want to part with." And it'll really be a portrait of him for me. And that's kind of this was around the time that I was developing a way of creating landscapes out of photo transfers that really were irreverent of the actual landscape in the photo, but just forced
Mm,
them into building a landscape that it always surprised me that they to me they read so landscape, like super classic landscapes, but
right.
a lot of times people will look at them and not really know that, oh well, that's an island in the center. And so this is kind of an island, and it's built out of a lot of my dad's his key imagery from
Mm,
his life. He used photo images of from his own childhood, relations of his, people he admired, events in history, and he was really marking himself as an individual, who he was, Carl the artist, who was Ojibwe, who was from these places in these times, living in this world. And it was really fundamental to my worldview, because I didn't really understand racism
mm,
like for a really long time, because he was operating so out of that. And my parents were from different worlds. My mother was she was American. um, she was adopted, so she didn't really know her background, but she was raised in Brooklyn. And my dad was Ojibwe from Mchigeeng First Nation, and this is the only place I've really known as home, or the only place I have family. And
right.
he was taking pictures of my family, him, and interspersing it with all the events of the world. So it was really usual to see pictures of my dad and my great grandpa and Einstein and thinkers, and to feel really, to feel really attached and related to the events of the world, like a
Mhm.
like a real citizen,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think. And
fully connected. And you can see how in this
yeah,
painting, and I'm curious if you're able to part with it in the end.
yeah, I did.
But also to see how, you know, you look at the painting and you read it as water, and then you read it as sky, and then it just becomes sort of water and sky, reflected or all at one. And obviously you see the moon that also repeats in his work and in your work, and this incredibly large work, that I guess in one way is literally water overflowing a beaver pond. The title says that to us, but again, I think that um, it is a kind of love letter to painting water, uh, to having a representational work, but at the same time, it defies that, and it just becomes pure experience of what it must be like to stand in front of this waterfall.
Yeah, I think that that's for me. Paint and color and art has really had a really it's been a really physical experience for me. So when I'm painting, and I especially when I came back to painting after my own rediscovery of paint making,
Mm-hmm.
and when I came back to it with my own paints, I really felt that same physicality that I remembered encountering it in the first place. Like I really use this green quite a bit, which, you know, all colors have their own stories and their own kind of like ghost stories almost. And green is one of those ones where it's kind of a common thing to know that green paintings aren't successful paintings. Or it's been said that you can't really sell a green painting, or
Mm.
it's unlikely. You're more likely to sell a blue painting, or those paintings are more likely to be considered successful. But I really enjoy using this green because it's relates back to one of my first experiences of color was looking up at spring maple trees with my mom, and I'm standing in the driveway, and I'm really young. It's one of my first memories ever. And I'm pointing up at them at the light coming through, and I'm asking her what the color is called. And she stands there with me and she holds my hand and she says, "Oh, that's chartreuse." And I was just so bowled over by like the shape of the word and how beautiful the word was, and at the same time to be looking at the color, and it had this real effect on me. So I stayed there, and then she left and she went in the house, and I went over towards the tree and I found the little baby maple trees and I ate them
Mm.
because I wanted to know like what it tasted like, the color, and to feel it on you, and just to really know it. And I think all my young childhood I was kind of making these experiences for myself to feel and really feel color when no one was watching. I used to go through a loose plank in the fence, and it'd swing sideways, and our neighbors had this giant peony garden, and all the peonies grew so close together that it was almost like a flat mat of peonies. But when I crawled in there from the underneath, there was only these thin pencil stalks, so the
Mm,
underneath
yeah.
was all hollow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There was
Mm-hmm.
no grass there. So I was tiny enough that I could just lay under there on the flat earth and look straight up. And it was that same thing of the light coming through and all the color. And I used to go in there and listen to music and just look look up at all the color. So
Well, you know, I love peonies, and they're kind of a magical flower because the flower itself is so like magnificent and heavy, and these thin things, it can barely withstand the weight of its own beauty. You know, Suzy Lake, another artist, has this saying that it's like it's overburdened with beauty. But
yeah,
my favorite thing is that when it comes out as a bud, you actually need these very specific ants to come in and eat the bud, or the kind of excretion of the flower, in order to make the peonies open. So it only blossoms because an insect actually interacts with it. And so when I look at a peonies, I always think about how everything is so interconnected and interdependent, in order to create such beauty. And when I look at a painting like this, and I think someone is asking why it's called Beaver Pond Overflowing. Um, I don't know if there's a specific place that you had in mind. I'm simply imagining that there was a beaver dam and then water just made it over.
Yeah, I have seen those, and it's it's really interesting. Up here I see a lot of different beaver ponds, and I've always wanted to do like a successful beaver pond painting or beaver house. And there's no house in this, but it's the
Mm,
suggestion. It's almost everything but the beaver pond.
yeah,
And you always see there's a struggle between the beaver and the water and the humans are all constantly kind of at war. And if the beaver pond is overflowing, then the, it's kind of like water has won. And the beaver
yeah.
didn't keep up, or something happened. He got busy. He couldn't keep that part up, and nature is kind of overgoing. And then conversely, sometimes you see them emptied. And when I see a beaver pond emptied, that's the humans, and
Yeah.
oftentimes the humans have drained the pond. And to me, it's a lot more fun. I think beavers are excited to see a beaver pond overflowing because it means they have more work to do, and they like to.
um, oh, if I can figure out how to advance the slides. I mean, what's beautiful about Manitoulin Island is really it's actually connected by land all the way to that other great site of powerful water, which is Niagara. And so when I see the waterfalls in your paintings and sort of the power of water, I'm reminded of that connection that seems very far away, but in fact, in geological terms, is quite nearby. So these images speak to some of the places that you are able to travel in order to, well, have inspiration not only for your painting but also for the most recent part of your art making, if you like, which is actually physically making the paint out of the place itself. Um, Beam paints.
Yeah, beam paints, and this was such a this has been such a gift to me, and such a gift to be able to share this with other people, and to be able to find a way to engage in my practice of art and paint making, and to do it in a shareable way. It's been a real blessing. And it was such a circuitous path to this, really, because
Mm-hmm.
I had started trying to make paints. I really I'd started a small art supply store with my previous partner, and things didn't go well, and we ended up splitting. And our it was actually really not good at all. It was
Mm.
a bad situation. And myself and my sons, we left that situation, and we found ourselves living on my mom's couch, and had less than nothing. I had $70,000 in minus nothing.
Yay.
Yeah, and but I felt so excited at that point because I was really lifted from a burden of having to care for someone who had addiction issues.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I was responsible for my own interests and my own time. And a certain level of panic and hysteria wasn't there. It was this peaceful window of time with my children were young. I was there. We were living together, and I started doing all the things that I loved doing in those early days when I was their age. And I started making paint and taking them with me, going to rock cuts and exploring the same way that my dad did for the same
Mm.
kind of paint. And then I thought to myself, uh, when I had the art supply store briefly for a couple of months, I loved I really loved sharing supplies with people and
Mm.
talking about art supplies, but had the distinct feeling that they wanted me to say that I had made the paint. I think because it was such a tiny shop, they thought, well, you must make this here. And at first, I felt so put upon, like, what? You want me to like make the paint too? It's a store. And then I couldn't really shake that feeling that I wanted to say, yes, I did. I made this. And at the time, I didn't think I could make paint. I hadn't connected my earlier experiences with understanding paint making and like all the stuff that I really knew, but it didn't have these labels,
Mm.
and it didn't have like, it wasn't formatted the way traditional education would format things. Just, it sounds so really silly. I totally appreciate that it sounds ridiculous to say you didn't know you knew, but I think a moment that crystallized things for me was buying certain things that you had to have to make paint. And then I remember looking at it in its raw state and thinking, I don't need to buy this. This is ridiculous. I know where I can find exactly like this. I know where I can find something that is going to substitute for this.
Yeah.
And I understand what I'm looking for now. And that's when that big aha moment came around for me. And I think after that moment happened, these small spheres that are in my hand there,
Mm.
that was part of shaping the learning how to make traditional watercolors, but then also learning how to shape it and shape the experience so that it gave people a bit of the sensation that I felt when I was going out and getting something from that existed in nature
Right.
and putting it into a physicality. And I think people really connected with it because artists are such sensitive people, and by and large, they have really been kind of ignored by the art manufacturing
Mm.
world. It's I think art supplies tend to be incredibly plastic,
Yeah.
very you know, non-reusable, and that's such a new thing because really before the advent of plastics, it was a really in-house thing, and it's
Yeah.
only just in these past maybe 100 years, 70 years that we've really become so dependent on pre-produced, and we've become so removed from what the actual substances are that we're using that
Yeah.
it's really a massive topic that I hope art schools kind of address more as we're
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
forward.
It, in my mind, it connects to what you said about being very young and wanting to taste the maple saplings, because it's that idea, you're holding it in your hand, you want to touch it, you want to feel it, you want to know what it's all about. And especially when you're going to make something, when you're going to put your imagination and creativity into something, you want to feel it with all of your senses, so this I've held your paint stones in my hand, and they're it's quite magical to have that sensation. And I think this has a little video in it.
Yeah, that's Fox Grape Lake. So that's a wild grape from here on the island. It just grows around here. And then it's boiled with a binder, and you get this amazing dark purple.
Mm.
And there are three color states that you can get from that one plant. You can have this beautiful, like, Welch's grape purple color. Then, if you push the pH, that this is a really interesting thing about ink making, and it becomes so alchemical that
Mm.
there's different things that you can do to affect the way that that's going to come out. So at the very bottom, the chemical reaction is happening with the limestone being
Yeah.
super alkaline and the grape juice being super acidic. It's having a reaction, and then a precipitate is being formed, and that's the lake. So I
Hmm.
think a lot of artists recognize that word for in pigments, but it's I recognize that word, like hearing my parents' watercolors, Madder Lake, different
Yeah.
lake pigments, and not just kind of hearing it as a beautiful word, but not really understanding what it meant. And
Yeah.
that's been a really interesting journey. That's me trying to figure out how to make paint. And this is right around the moment where I was like, good grief, I don't need to go and buy, you know, these parts of paint. I think I know what I'm doing. But there was a lot of I don't know what I'm doing right up until it kind of came together.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
And
wondering
the
also.
machine on the right,
Oh, yeah.
it's a triple mill. And it's something that I use for grinding certain pigments. Certain Something someone told me when I was starting was that all these pigments have such different personality, and I completely wrote them off. I thought, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. It's different. They're different colors, but they have behaviors specific to each color, and different ways that you can achieve different colors, and the mineral ways that those minerals react, how they handle. And you can see that one looks very cake icing. Some of
Yeah.
them are very, they have a gravity to themselves and they want to self
Mm,
level, and other ones want to really hold their own shape. So,
yeah. I'm wondering, this moment that you described, this moment of maybe sort of personal difficulty, but actually one that opens up a whole new way of thinking for you, and the relationship between your always love of color, but then what seems as an explosion of color in your paintings, in your most recent work, right? Is that how those two things are connected or entangled or related?
oh, it was it was really exhilarating coming back to painting. So much in a large way. It was that my I was also in a new relationship, and
Hmm.
my boyfriend had given me a whole garage to myself. And there's not a lot of people that you can tell, hey, I want to make paint, and I don't know, it's not. I had told a lot of people, and I got a lot of funny looks, and I definitely didn't have somebody say, "Of course you do. Here's a large undisturbed room for you to pursue that." And he did, and he cleared room for me in his life to be undisturbed, and he gave me space to do that, and also space to paint. So I painted and made paint in the same room for
Mm,
quite a long while, and there was no way to keep it from influencing them both from influencing each other. And in the beginning, before, I think most artists, all artists, I'm convinced, can relate to this, because when you're painting, so many of your choices are made based on what's at hand and
right.
what's available and what you can get. And the internet has changed that in a huge way, but it's still very, very, very much the working within limitations of what's at hand. And when I stepped into the position I was in control of the limitations, and they weren't limitations. There was no excuse for me to
Right.
not be using exactly the color I wanted to use there. And that's still a really thrilling part of going back to painting
Yeah.
and using different colors. And even the picture you showed before this of the lake and
Yeah.
the rocks, I had a really, when I first started doing it, I had this kind of picture in picture in picture experience of going to that location out in those islands in that boat and getting these rocks and taking a picture of that place because it was so beautiful. Then going home and making paint out of those rocks, and
Mm,
then doing a painting of that place and those rocks with that paint that came from
right.
there. And it was a moment when I was actually painting the rock with that was made from the paint of the rock, and it was
Right.
so circuitous that it was really a delightful feeling. Yeah.
And tell us what we're looking at here. These are some amazing places where you go and collect some of your materials.
Yeah, I think that was another thing to have. You know, that's one of the greatest things of being an artist that my dad used to say is that if you have a genuine premise, nothing is outside your field of inquiry. So wanting to make paint or wanting to be an artist almost gives you like a journalist's credential to say, okay, hello, I'm here with this. I'm going into this gravel pit and I have this bucket. Hi, what are you guys doing? And I've met so many people in gravel pits and people who work at quarries and different, they're working with the land and they're working with it in a really physical, hands-on way. And it's it's been really neat to kind of develop those kinds of relationships with places and people who work in them.
Yeah, yeah.
And some of this stone comes from a quarry out in Shishiguaning. And when I realized that they had this perfect kind of stone for the paint that I was making, I went out there to trade for it. And this is kind of like learned from my dad, the way he traded down south. So I went out there with a blueberry cake, and
Ah.
so I would trade blueberry cake for buckets of powdered limestone and different things like that. So they really liked when I was coming around. So, okay, cake, yep, you got the buckets, yep, and we would trade that.
It also takes you sort of far off the sort of beaten track to
Yeah,
encounter some magnificent creatures.
yeah. This isn't exactly this is it's a cow, but I had never seen a cow like that before. I turned around and found myself like face to nose with this really incredible animal.
Yeah,
And he was way back in well off the highway, so it was
yeah.
pretty neat to see him. The stone in the middle is also kind of one of those. I have an idea and something starting to make sense that if you want to make watercolor paints or paint and you want to make a terre verte paint, then you will inevitably be shown a website or a store where you can buy terre verte from France. And terre verte from France is fabulous, and I've made paint with it, and I love it.
Yeah.
But we have equally verte terre here, and that's part of the fun of it, is being able to explore those differences. And it's definitely something that's not. Well, actually, I'm pretty sure maybe we talked about this before, but I'm really very concerned about non-toxic qualities of paint, and a lot of that comes from artists understanding where their paint comes from.
Right, right.
And so much of this is there is a huge fascination with natural pigments right now,
Mm-hmm.
which is good and right and fabulous, but it can be so easily oversimplified into natural equals non-toxic, and that's
That's right. Yeah.
incredibly not the case.
No, no.
And more often than not, natural equals very toxic in the color world.
Well, on the sticker that we first showed, it said, "Please do not eat the paint," as a reminder,
Yeah.
that it may come from nature, but and it's all chemistry, but
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean that we can and you can eat it. It's like
Mm-hmm.
mushrooms. You can
Yeah,
eat some.
it should be. Yeah, it should be handled in a respectful way, because it's made out of rocks, and
And
it
we
shouldn't
can't.
go in your eye.
No, and also we can't digest that so well.
Yeah, exactly.
There was a lovely question that came through which spoke to how connected the paint making in your paintings are connected to the land, but wondering about a connection to the seasons, and whether there's a way in which you have to be mindful of that as you're creating different pigments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the next few slides will show some about that, that
Oh, let's
there
see.
are
Ah,
some, maybe where there's one of moose horns in here. Maybe it's
oh,
the next one.
maybe it's the next one.
Well,
Ah, here we
this is
go.
where, yeah, this is one I've made, I'm in the habit now of making bone black. And that's a really fascinating color because bone black is made, carbon black is made from carbonized matter. And once you start understanding where things come from, I'm really interested to find out what exactly is being carbonized to make
Mm,
carbon black. Because they're saying carbon black, so it is the burnt remnant of something, but they don't say what the something is. And what I've found in paint making is that all all substances, when they go to carbon, they go there differently, and they bring some of their original color and their original self with them. So it isn't just like a straight shot from here's something and we burned it and now it's black. And definitely making bone black was learning that. And traditionally it's made with cow's bones, and they're carbonized the same way you make charcoal. So they would go into a container, and that would become airtight, and then that would go into a furnace, and it would carbonize, which so it would burn without oxygen, and that would make it like a piece of charcoal
mm.
that could then be turned into a paint pigment. So I wanted to do that. And again, this is having really loving people in my life who just accommodate my inquiries. And I went to the hardware store and I started putting together what I knew I needed. I knew what I had to build. And I'm trying to make it large enough to put antler and moose antler into. And so I get a pipe, like a giant pipe, and I put a cap on the end, and then I'm trying to find another cap, and I'm like, hey, I need another cap for this. And the guy at my hardware store says, why are you building a pipe bomb? And I just looked at him and I said, oh, no, 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 no. I'm just making paint. And luckily, because it's the small town and everybody knows me there, they're like, oh, yeah, yeah, okay, go ahead. And they sold me my pipe bomb there. And then I went back home to my partner and I showed him, but I'm going to put this in our furnace. And you know it all went according to plan, but
Yep.
the the paint that came out of it was so beautifully brown and sepia,
Mm,
and it had a,
right.
a really gorgeous color. It definitely wasn't bone black like cow bone, and maybe that was an incomplete like combustion, but it was
Right.
a really beautiful paint. And it was interesting because it was at the time that Canadian Art had the cover, uh, had the wonderful piece by Dana Danger.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Um,
With the antlers. Yeah.
yeah, so with the antlers, and I think I put this on social media at the time with this large hashtag, uh, if because I made moose antler black, and I said if somebody doesn't buy this for Dana Danger for Christmas, the world's a cold hard place. And we had a big laugh about it. She messaged me and we talked a bit, and I ended up being the person. I sent her some of that paint
Oh, lovely.
just
Oh,
to
very good.
to
Very
try
good.
it. Yeah,
I
it was fun.
I remember you telling the story that you came across the place where the hunters where they kind of leave their carcasses. So over time, this has become a place where there's so much bone, or that in and of itself it can create an amazing color. And sometimes you pick the material just to see what color it's going to make.
Yeah, it is. This picture on the left is the back of my car at a certain time in summer. It definitely speaks to seasonality
Mm-hmm.
because there's a bucket, there's bones in there. It looks, it's an interesting looking car, and it it comes from those places. And being that there's so much hunting for subsistence here, and that it's really common for households to go and to take a deer or a moose for their family for the winter,
Mm-hmm.
that we do have a spot nearby where those remains go. And they don't go into the dump, they don't get thrown in the garbage, they go to a place where they can finish out their cycle and go into the earth and become part of the earth there. And
Mm-hmm.
that's that's been a really interesting spot for the bone black, and to kind of keep looking at what it can be and different things that can happen with it. I've heard that
Yeah.
there's another paint maker who made, I think he had a walrus tusk or something, some
Ah.
really obscure, very arctic piece of bone, and he made paint out of it in the same fashion. And apparently it was like jet black, so
Wow.
it was
Yeah.
interesting. Um,
I know.
this
Yeah, we're
this paint
just.
here comes from right where you were talking about there
Mm-hmm.
earlier, the Niagara Escarpment. So
Mm-hmm.
that's just from the our top end of it here.
That's right. And
Sorry, I interrupted you.
no, no, no. I interrupted you. Um, is that sumac? As I was looking at this photograph at the bottom, in the bottom bowl, is that sumac? And I remember you telling a story. I mean, of course, in my non-experienced head, I would imagine that sumac would make a beautiful red, but I don't think that it does.
Oh, sumac. Yeah, it's really interesting. The other thing that really struck me is how different it is to make ink
Mm-hmm.
from making paint. And then, understanding these two kind of pursuits are I think the thing where there's a difference is that ink making very commonly uses dyes, and dyes are very rare and not as present in paint. And so floral matter and plant matter is so much more used in ink making, and natural dyes lend themselves so beautifully to ink making. And it's also very seasonal too. That picture from the outer left going down to the sumac is goldenrod, tansy, and sumac.
Beautiful.
And yeah, I have a video actually that I took, and I posted it, even though it showed the everything all in all. I was gonna show like, oh, and here's how you make sumac ink, and I was doing it, and everything was going according to plan. And it just like the fox grape is really acidic. It has so many tannins, they're just like tea, and it's very strong. There's a lot of vitamin C. So I had concentrated it, and it's this incredibly acidic, very dark brown red, beautiful ink. And then I get my son is holding the camera. Okay, mom, go ahead. All right, I'm gonna do the thing. And when you change the pH of an ink, you really shift the color. And it's something that you could really go study at great length. And natural dyeing really takes studies it exactly, like
Mm-hmm.
the amount of iron and mordant and pH to really control the color outcome. But there's me. I just walked in with the baking soda, like I know what I'm doing, and I put it in, and whoosh, it did the color shift, but it just started expanding and expanding, and it overflowed the bowl, and it went all over. It was on my hands, and you can hear my son in the background saying, "That's why you're supposed to wear gloves." And it was
Well, your sons are as good assistants as you were of your father, right? You were a studio assistant for him for a while there at the end of his life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're almost out of time, but I wonder.
My son actually born on the same day as my father.
Oh, that is beautiful. I think we may have lost Anong. She's a little bit frozen, but she looks very happy. Oh, there you are. You're back. You looked very happy when you were frozen there.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I shut off the video. They said that would make this go easier.
It's true, and we're almost out of time. But I wanted to speak a little bit about your process in terms of making large paintings. You always make these sketches and all the references that you bring together, and it's very impressive. You know, you speak about how your father and your mother were interested in being in the world and all things being equal, whether they were members of your family or world events. And in the same way, I feel that you continue that tradition of bringing references that speak to you one way or another, and somehow put them together in these incredible paintings. And here you have this it's, oh, what do you call them? What they come in, the watercolors and the paints. Oh no, these are paints. What are they come in? These beautifully handmade.
Tisgans. It's an Ojibwe word that means put color on it. It's an action word. Yeah, these are. I've always done a lot of studies, and I really liked. My father would do studies, and I really enjoy that part of a very kind of classical practice where you can do a work and have it be done in the style of or after another artist. And I have different studies that I've done after Edward Munch and after Peter Doig and after Tom Thompson. A lot of landscape and people who I think paint a very heavy or a very palpable physicality. I think all three of those painters, you feel as if something has just happened or is just about to happen.
Yeah.
It's unfolding in their images. And when I plan out my paintings, I usually start out by doing a sketch. Even the largest paintings that I do start out as their main sketches being about the size of a stamp, maybe 1.5 inches by 1 inch, or maybe 4 inches by 6 inches, but very small. And I like to work out the compositions that way. And later, as I'm building it, then I'm more in the structure of the painting, and I connect all of the pieces to each other almost from inside the painting. But the overall shape of it is figured out at a very small scale. It's probably because I used to collect stamps, and I've always been enamored with how excellent stamps are in power of imagery. They just have to work and be legible and be eye-catching and visually appealing, but they only have the tiniest bit of space to do it in.
Right. And then it seems to me like you set yourself another challenge, which is to take these small things that are exquisite thoughts, studies of something, and then I think I heard you once turn them into monster paintings. Just massive.
Yes. It was actually after a particularly bumpy commission of somebody had wanted something, and they were specifically wanting it to interact with their couch in a certain way, and the whole process was so painful. I remember after that I said, for the next few years, I'm only gonna paint paintings that are so large that I'll never have to have this conversation again.
That is
Ah,
perfect, and a perfect place to say again, Chimigwich, for joining us. I had always hoped to bring you to the AGO and have this conversation in person, and I'm sure we will after the pandemic is over. But it's been wonderful to be able to be with you and to hear about your process and the way in which everything is so interconnected between the materials, the ideas, and your creation of these magical images. So chimigwichanong.
oh my gosh. Thank you, Georgiana. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.